The prairie wind carried with it the hush of a place too wide for comfort, a place where silence sat heavy on the bones and the sound of one knock against a lonely door could echo for miles. That afternoon, the sound startled Clara May Dalton where she stood at her kitchen table, hands resting on the rough wood, eyes fixed on nothing at all. She had lived with silence since the day her husband was taken from her beneath the hooves of his own cattle, silence that pressed like a weight against her chest until she could no longer remember what laughter sounded like in her home. When that knock came, sharp and insistent, her breath caught in her throat, half in fear, half in some ache she would not name. She moved slowly to the window, peering through the thin lace curtain. A man stood there, tall, shoulders bent with the wear of work and solitude. His coat bore the dust of the trail, his hat shadowed a face carved by wind and time. Beside him stood a girl, no more than 8, barefoot on the dirt, holding a ragged doll against her chest as if it were her only shield. Clara's first thought was that they looked like strays, souls who had drifted too long without an anchor. When she opened the door just a crack, the man removed his hat, eyes lowered in quiet respect. "Name's Jonas McGraw," he said, his voice low, gravelly, as though seldom used. "Was told you might be needing a rancher." His words hung between them, simple and plain, yet heavy with implication. Clara stiffened. She knew well enough what folks in town had been whispering, that she couldn't hold her land together alone, that grief had left her too frail, too broken, to last another winter on her own. Pride rose sharp in her throat. She lifted her chin, letting her gaze settle not on the man but on the child half hidden behind him. The girl's eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with something Clara recognized too well, an emptiness, a hunger for belonging. "I don't need charity," Clara said, her voice tight. "And I don't need a man to tell me what I can or can't manage." She shut the door before he could answer, before that wounded look in his eyes could pierce the armor she wore. Yet even with the door closed, she felt the echo of their presence on her porch, a shadow pressing against her solitude. The next days passed heavy with labor. Clara rose with the dawn, mended what she could, fought what she could not. The fence near the southern pasture had splintered, and the cattle threatened to wander. Her arms burned with the weight of the work, yet she gritted her teeth, unwilling to ask for help. When she came around the corner of the barn and found Jonas there, hammer in hand, driving nails into the broken fence post, her first feeling was anger. She told him to leave, voice sharp, but he only tipped his hat and kept working, each strike of the hammer steady, unhurried, unshaken by her resistance. Eliza, his daughter, sat on the fence rail, swinging her legs, her doll tucked under her arm. Clara tried to ignore the way the girl watched her with quiet intensity, like someone measuring whether this new figure might mean safety or disappointment. When the girl hopped down, crossed the dust between them, and held out a wildflower, thin, half-wilted, but offered with both hands, Clara's anger faltered. She accepted it without a word, her fingers brushing the child's. That small touch carried more weight than she wanted to admit. But the town was watchful, and their tongues were quick. At the mercantile, Clara caught the glances, heard the snickers half hidden behind gloved hands. "The widow's found herself a helper," one woman whispered. "Give it time, and she'll have herself a husband too." Heat rose to Clara's cheeks, not from longing but from the shame of being spoken of as if her grief were a stage play for others to interpret. She left the store quickly, but the sting lingered, driving her to push Jonas further away when he returned. Yet Jonas was not a man to press or to plead. He kept showing up in small, quiet ways. A stack of firewood left at her porch, the roof patched without a word of request, the corral mended when she wasn't looking. Clara resented the way her land seemed steadier with him near, the way his silence carried a kind of respect she had not expected. She resented most of all the way Eliza's laughter began to thread its way into her home when the girl lingered in her kitchen, helping peel apples with clumsy hands, spilling flour on the floor as if she had always belonged there. One stormy evening, when the sky opened with rain and thunder rolled over the hills, Clara found Jonas and Eliza on her porch, soaked to the skin, carrying firewood in their arms. Something inside her broke at the sight, some barrier of pride too long held. She opened the door wide, letting them inside, the warmth of her hearth chasing the chill from their skin. They ate in silence that night, the only sound the crackle of the fire, yet the quiet was different from the emptiness she had known. It was full, somehow, with the unspoken comfort of company. Jonas spoke little, but when he did, Clara noticed his words carried the weight of truth. He told her how he had lost his wife years before, how Eliza had known too much sorrow for her age, how the trail had worn them thin but not broken. Clara listened, her chest aching with the recognition of shared loss. She saw in him not a drifter seeking advantage but a man who had carried grief in silence and was still standing. When the storm passed, Jonas rose to leave, but Eliza clung to Clara's skirt, reluctant to go. Clara rested a hand on the girl's head, smoothing her tangled hair, and for a moment the house seemed to breathe again, alive with warmth. Jonas watched quietly, something unspoken in his eyes, but he did not linger. They stepped out into the damp night, leaving Clara alone once more. Yet her solitude no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like an emptiness she could no longer defend. That night, as she stood at the window watching the prairie glisten under the moonlight, Clara realized the silence of her home was shifting. It no longer belonged only to grief. It had been stirred by the knock of a stranger and the gaze of a child, unsettled by kindness, softened by presence. She told herself she was not ready to yield, not ready to be judged by town gossip or bound by another man's will. But she could not shake the memory of Eliza's small hand pressing a flower into hers, nor the sound of laughter that had once again touched her walls. The wind moved across the land like a hymn, carrying with it both the ache of memory and the whisper of change. Clara knew something had begun, something she could neither stop nor name, and though she feared what might follow, she also found herself waiting, listening for another knock at her door. The weeks that followed wore thin against Clara May Dalton's resolve, though she clung to her pride as a wounded creature clings to its last defense. Each day Jonas McGraw's presence seemed to linger at the edges of her land, sometimes in the form of fence posts set straighter than she had left them, sometimes as stacked wood that appeared overnight at her porch. She told herself she had no need for such quiet generosity, yet when she returned to an orderly field or a steady roof, her breath loosened in relief. That relief unsettled her more than the loneliness ever had, for it meant her defenses were slipping, and she could not afford to be dependent again. The town noticed, too. Whispers circled around her like smoke, never burning outright but leaving a stench she could not shake. At Sunday service, Clara sat stiff on the wooden pew, hands folded tight in her lap, as women exchanged glances. One leaned to another and murmured about Jonas, how widows attracted men looking for easy ground. The words sliced her deeper than she wished to admit. When Jonas appeared beside her in the aisle after service, Eliza's small hand in his, Clara felt every eye upon her. Shame rose in her chest, not because she disbelieved Jonas's worth, but because she feared what those eyes might see in her, neediness, frailty, weakness. That evening, as dusk sank into the prairie, she found Jonas by her barn, fixing a broken latch. She told him, with a trembling voice that disguised itself as firm, that she could no longer accept his help. His eyes steadied on hers, searching for some honesty behind her words, but he found only the wall she raised. Without protest, he gathered Eliza close, lifted his hat, and walked away. The sound of their retreat across the yard hollowed the air until silence returned heavier than before. That night Clara sat alone by the fire, the ticking of the clock louder than any company. She thought of Eliza's laughter spilling across her kitchen, the girl's small hands dusted with flour, the echo of a child's joy her house had not known for years. The absence pressed on her like a weight she had chosen but could no longer bear. The silence did not comfort her any more. It gnawed. A few days later, the prairie tested her resolve with merciless force. A spark, carried by dry wind, set grass ablaze near her southern pasture. Fire spread like a hungry beast across the land, licking fences and swallowing fields. Clara, frantic, rushed into the smoke with a wet cloth pressed to her face, dragging water buckets with arms already weary. The flames snapped and hissed, the air thick with ash. She fought until her lungs screamed, until her knees buckled beneath the strain. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed into the blackened grass, the heat pressing down as though the earth itself had turned against her. Out of the haze, a figure emerged. Jonas, shirt torn and face darkened with soot, lifted her into his arms with a strength that left no room for argument. Eliza clung close behind, her small voice carrying through the crackle of fire, urging them forward. Clara tried to protest, tried to tell him to save the cattle, the barn, the last piece of her husband's legacy, but Jonas silenced her with action rather than words. He carried her to the safety of her porch, laid her gently against the cool wood, and returned to the inferno without hesitation. Through half-closed eyes, she saw him drive the animals to safety, shield Eliza from stray embers, and fight back the fire with a desperation that was not his duty but his choice. When the flames at last subsided, leaving the land scarred but not destroyed, Clara awoke in her parlor. Her throat was raw, her body heavy with exhaustion. By her side sat Eliza, her small hand wrapped firmly around Clara's, as though afraid to let go. Across the room Jonas rested against a chair, his head bowed, soot streaking his skin, every line of him etched with fatigue. For the first time Clara studied him without her armor. He was no drifter preying on her weakness, no opportunist seeking her land. He was a man who had risked everything to keep her standing, a father who carried his daughter's hope like a lantern in the dark. Her voice cracked when she spoke, quieter than the rustle of the curtains. "You don't have to leave." The words hung fragile in the air, yet they were more binding than any vow she could have made. Jonas lifted his gaze, disbelief softening into a relief so deep it seemed to ease the very lines of his face. He did not move toward her, did not press for more, only nodded once, as though to promise he understood. Eliza, unable to hold her joy, leaned against Clara's side, her smile bright against the soot still marking her cheeks. In that small gesture, Clara felt the emptiness of her house lift. It was not filled by declarations or grand promises, but by the simple weight of presence, of a man and his daughter who chose to remain. The days after the fire stitched themselves into something new. The townsfolk, who had once gossiped in corners, now watched in silence as Jonas and Clara worked side by side to restore the land. The barn, though scarred, stood upright. The cattle grazed once more under a watchful sky. Clara walked through her fields not as a widow barely surviving, but as a woman who had learned to carry grief without letting it chain her. Jonas worked beside her, steady and unassuming, his silence no longer that of loneliness but of partnership. And the house, once so heavy with quiet, filled with Eliza's laughter, with the rhythm of footsteps moving together rather than apart, with the sound of life finding its way back into walls that had long echoed with loss. Clara knew the town would talk still, but she no longer feared their words. What was whispered in corners could not outweigh what had been earned through fire, through trust, through the quiet endurance of a man and a woman who had each known sorrow but had chosen to heal in one another's company. The prairie wind carried new songs then, not the hollow cry of emptiness, but the hum of resilience, of beginnings stitched together by steady hands. Clara often stood at her porch in the evenings, watching the land shift gold beneath the setting sun, listening not for the silence she once mistook for safety but for the knock she had nearly turned away. It had come once as a stranger's request, uncertain and awkward, but it had become the sound of salvation, the moment that led her back to life. She turned to the horizon, her heart no longer bound by fear of judgment or pride. What had begun with a knock had ended in a home, not made of timber and nails alone but of courage, forgiveness, and the fragile, unspoken choosing of one another. And though Clara knew hardship would come again, storms, drought, the weight of work and the sharpness of loss, she also knew she would not face it alone. Jonas's strength, Eliza's laughter, her own hard-won resilience, all these were the fire within her now, burning brighter than the blaze that had nearly taken everything. She lifted her eyes to the sky, and for the first time in years, she felt whole.